Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to week 4 of our series called A Better Way. This week we get to talk about the most powerful word in the entire English language, the word love. You know, the New Testament teaches us over and over the absolute importance of this one single word, that there really is no equivalent. There's no equal. The Apostle Paul, he tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that love is the greatest virtue of all. Greater than hope, greater even than faith. Love is number 1 on the list. He also tells us that love is the greatest spiritual gift that we could have. In fact, without it, no other gifts even matter. They're all meaningless. He says we could speak in the tongues of angels. We could understand all the mystery, all the knowledge. He even says we could have faith that moves mountains, or literally give all we have over to the poor. But if we do not have love, all of that's nothing. It's just clatter. It's just noise. It's empty. And Jesus, he agrees with Paul in Matthew chapter 22. This really educated religious leader, he approaches Jesus and he asks him, which is the greatest command? And without flinching, Jesus responds with the word love. He says, love God. He says, love your neighbor like you love yourself. And that's it. That's the greatest. It's not obedience. It's not worship. It's not generosity. No, it's just love. That's the list. Love is number 1, and there really is no number 2. Jesus says all the law and the prophets, they hang on that one command. They all depend on love. So then the question becomes, what exactly is love? And see, this is where we kind of get tripped up, because love is defined in all sorts of different ways in our English language, isn't it? I can say, I love the Oakland A's, or I love pineapples on pizza. And then later that same day, with equal emphasis and passion, I could turn to my wife and say, I love you. But those cannot mean the same thing, right? Those cannot carry the same weight. There's no way I love a sports team like I love my wife. You see, in the English language, we ask this one 4-letter word to carry far too much weight. And the problem is, because of this, it starts to lose its meaning. It loses its power. So much so that when we read about love in the New Testament, it doesn't really stand out to us. We just read it and sometimes move on. It doesn't challenge us or change us like it's meant to. But see, this was not the case with the original New Testament audience. Because in English, we define the scope of love using that one word. But in Greek, they used multiple words to define love. You know, the 2 most popular words that they used to define love were the words eros and philia. The word eros is where we get our English word erotic. It's the romantic love that we see in movies. It's that warm and fuzzy feeling we get when someone does something that makes us feel special or beautiful or important. Eros asks the question, what can I get out of this? How can my needs be fulfilled? How will this make me feel valued or worthy or important? The bottom line is, Eros is all about me and my needs, fulfilling my desires. Now, let me be clear. There's nothing bad about this kind of love. It's just not the love that Jesus or the apostles had in mind in the New Testament. The second most popular Greek word for love was the word philia or phileo. It means relational love or brotherly love. It's a bit deeper than eros because instead of asking the question, what can I get out of this? Philia asks the question, what can we get out of this? See, it's about us, not just me. Now, this is what healthy marriages and friendships, they blossom into. It's us, it's togetherness, it's partnership, it's me and you. Bottom line, while Eros seeks to fulfill our desire to be worthy and valued and important, Philia seeks to fulfill our desire to belong together, to fit in, to not be alone. And again, there's nothing wrong with this kind of love. It just falls short of the kind of love described in the New Testament. And here's why. Because both eros and philia, they each have conditions attached to it. Eros says, I love you when. I love you when you make me feel valued or worthy or important. I love you when you bring me flowers or when you cook breakfast for me or when you kiss me. Philia says, I love you because. I love you because of the things we have in common. I love you because we have the same parents, or I love you because we have the same children. I love you because we both root for the same team. I love you because we're both American or we both agree politically. I love you because we're both the same race or ethnicity. See, philia loves because it belongs. It feels safe with a person because you're like me or we fit together. But again, both eros and philia, they're conditional. They're limited. Because what happens when that person no longer makes us feel valued? What happens when we don't feel that sense of belonging with them? When we disagree or have conflict, or worse, when we get offended? It's over, right? File the divorce papers, delete that number from our phone, unfollow that person, stop going to that small group, never go to that restaurant again. That's why they say we live in a cancel culture. Like, we're so quick to cancel people. You're done. I'm moving on. Next. Why? Because you stop meeting my needs. You stop fulfilling my desires. And see, that's the kind of love that we're all used to. But it is not the kind of love that the New Testament writers are describing, which is why they used a different Greek word altogether to define love, a word called agape. Now, agape wasn't used that much in the New Testament days. In fact, during that time, the New Testament writers, they kind of made this word famous by how they described it and how they defined it. Because agape was a rare kind of love, a love that was deeper than all the rest. In fact, agape is such a deep love, there's literally no end to it. There's no boundaries or limits around it. There's no conditions attached to it. If eros says, I love you when, and philia says, I love you because, then agape says, I love you, period. Nothing comes after. It's just, I love you. You don't have to meet my desires. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to be like me. No, I just choose to love you, period. Even if you don't love me back, even if you hate me, I will still love you. And see, this kind of love, it was unheard of, which is why when the early church would have heard Jesus say this or read it in Paul's or John's or Peter's or James' letters, it would have immediately gotten their attention. Because who on earth loves this way? Who on earth loves without conditions, without getting something in return? And the answer, of course, is nobody. No one on earth can produce agape love because we're conditioned to have conditions. It's who we are. It's what we do. This love, agape love, it must come from outside of us. It must come from outside this earth, which is exactly what John says in 1 John chapter 4, verse 7, when he writes, Dear friends, let us love, let us agape one another, for love comes from God. And see, that's the key. If we're going to understand true biblical love, then we must first and foremost understand that it does not come from us. It comes from God. Now, this means we can only love others if we first receive this love from God. And that's exactly what John says a few verses later in verse 19. He says, we love because God first loved us. In other words, agape love cannot flow from us. It can only flow through us. We're kind of like a pitcher of water. This pitcher, it cannot produce anything on its own. No, it can only pour out what's been poured into it, which means if it's empty, then it can't pour anything out, right? It needs to go back to the source to get filled up again. Guys, the same is true with us. When it comes to radical agape love, we can only pour out what's been poured into us. If we're not able to love others, it's because we have not received the love of Christ ourselves. And see, I think this is where the rubber meets the road for us today. We live in a culture that's filled with hatred and judgmentalism, so quick to give up on each other as soon as there's disagreement or conflict. And we as Christ followers, we have this great opportunity to stand out and display this different way, this unconditional agape love that's going to transform our world. But instead, we all too often just fit right in. We can become just like everyone else around us, known for what we're against. If someone stops meeting our needs or stops fulfilling our desires or being like us, we don't want anything to do with that person unless they change. We would rather point out why they're wrong than love them in spite of it. Why is that? Is it because we're not trying hard enough to love like God? No. And see, that's the issue. It is not try harder. That pitcher cannot fill itself up, remember? No, it has to go back to the source. See, we get empty. We need a refill. We need to reflect again on the beautiful, life-changing truth of God's agape love that's been poured out on us. Truths like, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That though we were enemies of God, He reconciled Himself to us through the death of His Son. That for God so loved the world that He gave Jesus, not took, not judged, not consumed. No, He gave us His Son so that we could have eternal life. Not because we deserved it, not because we earned it, not because we agreed with Him or met His conditions. No, simply because He loves us, period. See, when we remember these truths, when we call upon them daily, when we preach them to ourselves in the morning, what they do is they fill us up. And when we get filled, we cannot help but pour it out on those around us, regardless of what they do or don't do, regardless of whether or not they're with us or against us, regardless even if they deserve it. We just love. We just pour out, period. That's agape love. That's the love of the New Testament. That, friends, is the mark of the Christ follower. Imagine how much the world around us could change if we just received and poured out this kind of agape love on the people around us. So here's my question that I'll leave you with today. Are you full of God's love? Or are you running on empty? The way we can tell is by how much it overflows to those around us.